Hello and welcome to tonight's episode of On the Record. My name is Vuyo Mvoko. Well, at last, a national action plan to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia and related intolerance. What does it entail? What are its chances of success? And how can you get involved? And before we say goodbye, a little something to remember the chief whip of the ANC, who today made a sudden announcement that he was resigning from Parliament with immediate effect. Well, the timing of reinstating and later dropping criminal charges against President Jacob Zuma came into sharp focus today at the North Gauteng High Court. Acting NPA head Mokotedi Mshe decided to prosecute Zuma after the ANC's Polokwane conference.
Leonard McCarthy came under fire again as the NPA counsel accused him of gross abuse of the prosecutorial system. Counsel for the NPA confirmed that the then acting NPA boss, Mokotedi Mshe, felt betrayed after listening to the tapes.
Is it more important to pursue the conviction of one person, even where the merits may appear to be good? Or is it rather more important to assure the public that at any cost, the prosecutorial authority will not be impeded, it will not be affected, it will not be influenced by outsiders, and it will always remain independent?
The court questioned why McCarthy was only asked to clarify a day after the decision was taken to drop the charges. Counsels for the NPA and the president argue that the DA's application is limited to just a review of the decision to drop the charges. And even if the court rules in their favor, it doesn't translate to an automatic reinstatement of the charges.
So are you suggesting that they should amend their notice of motion?
If I wanted to amend it, they should have done so a very long time ago. That is the submission I make. And if I had done so, we would have dealt with that on affidavit. We would have raised issues about that. There are a whole number of issues that would have become important, including the indictment of a sitting president.
However, constitutional experts assert that a sitting president doesn't enjoy a criminal indemnity law. While the heads of arguments have wrapped up, some glaring questions still remain. Under whose instructions did Leonard McCarthy try to influence the timing of President Jacob Zuma's prosecution, and who gave the president's counsel access to the tapes that would lead to the withdrawal of the corruption charges? Aldrin Simpier, SABC News, North Gauteng High Court.
Well, Aldrin Sampier joins me here in the studio for the first part of the program as we bring you the highs and lows of day 2 of the spy tapes case currently going on at the Pretoria High Court, where the Democratic Alliance wants the court to set aside former NPA head Mokotedi Mshe's decision to drop corruption charges against President Jacob Zuma. Aldrin, welcome and thanks very much for joining us.
Good evening, Vuyo.
Well, not as dramatic as Parliament was yesterday, but I'm sure, it was something worth looking forward to, wasn't it?
Most definitely, especially hearing the explanation coming from the NPA, why they feel that the decision by Mokotedi Mshe, who was the acting head of the NPA at the time, was rational. And on the basis of that was that after listening to the spy tapes, he decided he was very angry. And on the 1st of April, when he had a meeting with the deputies in the prosecutorial team, he decided that the charges against President Jacob Zuma should be dropped. However, though, the question has always been that on the 31st of March 2009, the decision was still to prosecute President Jacob Zuma or to go ahead and prosecute the president. However, that changed later on the 1st of April after Mokotedi Mshe had an opportunity to listen to the tapes. And some of the questions that have been asked from the justices as well is what could it have been in those tapes that have led Mokotedi Mshe to decide that, listen, let's go ahead and prosecute, let's go ahead and not prosecute the president.
Well, there has been no doubt value in all these cases being, televised live. How packed was the room, and people like really, apart from the journalists, really following this to the letter to really get a sense of, the underlying issues that everyone wants to.
Well, Probably not as intrigued as yesterday. When I was looking at some of the visuals from yesterday's court proceedings, it was quite a packed room to such a point where journalists had to sit right in the front bench as well to make space for the public gallery and those who want to sit in the public gallery. Well, this time around, it was not as packed. And I would have thought actually that more people would come out, considering that for the first time we would hear from Kemp, Kemp, who was representing the president, as to where does he stand with regards to the decision to drop the charges. And now we know that he supports the NPA's decision to drop those charges.
Well, let's start. Our first highlight is, of course, the NPA's lawyer with the points he was making on behalf of the National Prosecuting Authority. Let's take a listen.
Using one sense of justice and propriety as a yardstick by which McCarthy's abuse of the process is measured, an intolerable abuse has occurred which compels a discontinuation of the prosecution. And in the middle of the page, it follows, therefore, that any timing of the charging of an accused person which is not aimed at serving a legitimate purpose is improper, irregular, and an abuse of process. A prosecutor who uses a legal process against an accused person to accomplish a purpose for which it is not designed abuses the criminal justice system and subjects the accused person to that abuse of process. Mshe continues at page 130 of his statement, the abuse of process through conduct which perverts the judicial or legal process in order to accomplish an improper purpose offends against one's sense of justice. McCarthy used the legal process, he says, for a purpose outside and extraneous to the prosecution itself. Even if the prosecution itself is conducted by the prosecution team is not tainted, the fact that McCarthy, who was head of the DSO and was in charge of the matter at all times and managed it almost on a daily basis, manipulated the legal process for purposes outside and extraneous to the prosecution itself. It is not so much the prosecution itself that is tainted, but the legal process itself. And then finally, in the last page, he says in the second paragraph, in the light of the above, I've come to the difficult conclusion that it is neither possible nor desirable for the NPA to continue with the prosecution of Mr. Zuma. And importantly is the following. He says in the fourth paragraph, let me also state for the record that the prosecution team itself had recommended that the prosecution should continue even if the allegations are true, and that it should be left to a court of law to decide whether to stop the prosecution. However, I believe that the NPA has a special duty as one of the guardians of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to ensure that its conduct is at all times beyond reproach. And then he says, as an officer of the court, I feel personally wronged and betrayed, that on a number of occasions I have given evidence under oath that there has not been any meddling or manipulation of the process in this matter. It is with great regret that I have to say today that in relation to this case, I cannot see my way clear to go to court in future and give the nation this assurance. So having been manipulated by McCarthy, he's assuring the entire public in South Africa that this prosecution is untainted. Everything is being done above board. And in truth and in fact, that wasn't what was happening. So, in conclusion, I want to emphasize what I said right at the beginning. At the end of the day, we know that this is the discretion which the Constitution and the legislation reposes in the National Director. It's his discretion. And courts will not interfere unless there are exceptional circumstances within which to do so. And the question to be asked is this. If one sees that the integrity of the National Prosecuting Authority has been impugned, if in the eyes of the public, it can no longer hold up the badge which the Constitution requires, that we are independent, we conduct ourselves without fear, favor, or prejudice, without any outside influences, whether economic, whether political. Unless the public repose that trust in the National Prosecuting Institution, then the democracy in our country fails. There is nothing more important. You can't have a constitutional democracy unless you have an independent prosecutorial authority. And one has to ask the question, as he did, as Mshe did, is it more important to pursue the conviction of one person, You must put out of your minds the respect that this was the president. Is it more important to pursue the conviction of one person, even where the merits may appear to be good? Or is it rather more important to assure the public that at any cost, the prosecutorial authority will not be impeded, it will not be affected, it will not be influenced by outsiders, and it will always remain independent?
Well, Aldrin, really, I mean, the NPA's lawyer trying to appeal, I think at times, to people's emotions, that there is a bigger picture that as a nation we should look at. What did you think? What did you make of his?
Well, if you just listen to what Epstein said as well around when Mqodeli Mse made that announcement, and he said that this has been the most difficult decision that I have had to take, and he says that he was embarrassed by Leonard McCarthy. He feels that he was manipulated as well. And I guess that the first red flag for Mqodeli Mse should have been back in 2007 when there was this discussion around when to reinstate the charges against President Jacob Zuma before the Polokwane conference or after the Polokwane conference. And then the decision was then taken, Leonard McCarthy then took the decision to indict, to serve the indictment on President Jacob Zuma on the 20th. Mqodeli Mse went on to 702 in an interview and then said on 702 that when he was asked, when will you guys indict President Jacob Zuma? And he said, no, we'll do it in the new year. And then he got a call from Leonard McCarthy, who then said that, no, actually, we're doing it right away, immediately after the Polokwane conference. So I guess that should have been the first red flag around whether he believes there was some sort of manipulation of the process. And then, of course, these recordings as well also gives an insight as to the extent at which Leonard McCarthy went to try and influence when the charges against the president should be reinstated. There also was this argument that Bulelani Ngcuka, and this is the NPA saying this, that Bulelani Ngcuka was also pulling the strings and he was acting behind the scenes as well. And Mqodeli Mse also said during a meeting that they had with the deputies that the then President Thabo Mbeki could also be behind the curtains, but there's no evidence to substantiate that.
Well, then President Zuma's lawyers, Advocate Kemp, takes the podium. Then what?
Well, when Advocate Kemp, Kemp took the podium, it was literally quiet in the courtroom. We all wanted to hear what he was going to say. And he just went straight into it, that there was political interference. And he went on about it really to some extent trying to prove that the systems were being manipulated, the powers of the NPA were being manipulated to make sure that it influenced the outcome of the Polokwane conference. And then let's just take a listen to this argument that he sets out while speaking to the judges.
What I am saying to this court and what we are contending for, that in this case, the reason for that was very different. The reason was to have a different individual as president of the ANC. That was what this was all about. And that is an enormous thing. It is like we are arresting somebody that we know is going to be a kidney donor to Mr. Zuma. We know he's critical. If we arrest this person now instead of in a week's time, maybe it will be too late. If it happens that another kidney is found after you've done it, it does not change the enormity of the abuse. The abuse is not, well, you get it a week earlier or you get it a week later. It is, what is the NPA's powers being used for? It's being used to determine who is going to be the president of this country.
What an analogy there. The analogy around the kidney, some sort, creates that impression that this was a matter of life or death when it comes to the political career of Jacob Zuma.
Just observing the other people in the room, when that was said, what did people react in any way? Like,
Well, you see, amongst the journalists, yes, we reacted like, "Whoa, that's quite deep, quite a deep analogy there." Considering that this is somebody who was willing to give the president a kidney, but then there was this discussion around when should we arrest this person who's going to give the president the kidney, and obviously you know what effect that will have on the life of the president. So that was quite deep for journalists sitting there. I don't know how the public would have reacted to that analogy.
Perhaps more importantly, what was the reaction of the judge? Well, they hardly show emotion or what they are thinking. But, I mean, do they raise any particular issues after listening to both gentlemen?
Well, the big question for the judges is the issue around the timing of the decision to reinstate the charges. Because remember that when Bulelani Ngcuka back in 2003 decided that he's going to charge Sabir Sheikh at the time, he said that there is a prima facie case against Jacob Zuma, who was then the deputy president of the country, but we will not go ahead with reinstating those charges. Vusi Pikoli then came, he said, let's reinstate those charges. The matter then went to the court. It was struck off the roll because they were not ready at the time. And then eventually it came down to Mkotedi Mpshe, who decided to reinstate the charges back in 2007. And it was Mkotedi Mpshe, as the acting head of the NPA, who also then 2 years later decided to drop the charges. And what we should not forget is that at the time when he decided to drop the charges, they already had access to the transcripts that were given by President Jacob's legal team of the recordings between Bulelani Ngcuka as well as Leonard McCarthy. And let's just take a listen to this contention between Justice Cynthia as well as Sebastian, who's representing the NPA.
At this late stage, he had not yet decided what to do.
Well, what also bothers me, Mr. Epstein, if you look at paragraph 256, a further issue that concerned Mshe was the fact that Ngcuka and Mkhosi had not been given an opportunity to comment on the allegations against him. Mshe felt that this was important to do before he made a final decision. What I want to put to you, what I find strange, is that the questions were sent to McCarthy on the 2nd of April, after the decision had been taken.
I'll have to check that because I think that they sent it to McCarthy earlier and he responded saying he wants additional information. I'm not sure if it was only sent on the 1st of April.
But what I'm trying to put to you, that Mshe was concerned about this, but he made the decision nevertheless, because that brings the question, why was the 1st of April such a magic date? Why did he have to take the decision before on the 1st of April?
That came from Justice Litwaba as well. Why was the 1st of April such an important day? He even asked Kemp, are there any records that show that by the 1st of April there should be a decision that should be taken from the representation given by President Jacob Zuma's legal team? And what Kemp is saying is that if you perhaps look into what was going to be happening that year, because 2009, remember, was a general election year. And while the president was quite confident, I guess, at the time, and the ANC, that Jacob Zuma will become the president of the country. And as Kemp said, in a few months, Jacob Zuma, as he was at the time, without the presidential title, Jacob Zuma would be inaugurated and become the president of the country. So we need to get clarity around whether do you want to charge him or not. And if you want to proceed with the charges, we're going to apply for a permanent stay, which would declare this matter a miscarriage, a miscarriage of justice.
Well, what should we expect tomorrow?
Well, tomorrow we expect the DA's legal counsel to wrap up the arguments and a rebuttal of some of the arguments coming from the NPA as well as President Jacob Zuma's counsel. And the biggest argument coming from both of them is that the application in front of the court is to get the court to instruct the NPA's current head to review the decision that was taken by Mkotedi Mpshe at the time. And it's not to reinstate the charges, like with the case of Richard Mdluli, when Freedom Under Law went to court and asked for the court to reinstate the charges against the Richard Mdluli.
Alden Sampier, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Alden Sampier will, of course, be back at the High Court tomorrow, and we'll be bringing you whatever will have transpired there tomorrow. Well, we're going to take a quick break now. After the break, the National Action Plan to Combat Racism, Xenophobia and Related Prejudice will now be the subject of public consultations around the country. What does it entail? And perhaps more importantly, what is your role in it? How are we all going to make it work to deal with this scourge that has been with us, especially in the past few months? So don't go away.
The big news is Newsroom.
We also stream live on YouTube.
Whether you're at home, at the office, or at the gym, wherever you are, Newsroom is right there with you. Bringing you all the latest news, updates, sports, weather, and everything in between. Get all the latest news you need on the go via live streaming on our YouTube channel. That's Newsroom, weekdays at 9 a.m. only on the SABC News Channel.
SABC News. We report, contextualize and present news and current affairs honestly, fairly and fully. We consider it a duty to provide consistent, relevant, useful and top quality information and analysis. Our mission is to provide credible, accurate and interesting news programming, bringing news into everyone's homes in everyone's languages. Thank you, South Africa, for relying on SABC News for quality news output and for making us your #1 source of information. SABC News, Africa's news leader.
Welcome back. You're watching On the Record. Well, this week, the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development launched public hearings into the National Action Plan to Combat Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia and Related Intolerance. The plan is now in the public domain, and the department is holding public hearings with relevant stakeholders. At a time when racism, xenophobia and related intolerance continue to rear their ugly head in the country, discussions around the National Development Plan come on the eve of Human Rights Month. This year, the theme is No to Racism, No, Not in My Name. The National Action Plan does not seek to replace standing legislation, but rather to complement it. Now, to talk more on this, we're joined by Nonkululeko Sindane, who is the Director General at the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, who is in our Pretoria studio. Welcome, Sisi.
Thank you, Vuyo, and good evening to you and to your listeners.
Well, we're also joined by Stanley Hankerman from the Institution of Justice and Reconciliation, who is in our Cape Town studios. Welcome to you too, Stanley.
Thank you very much, Vuyo. Lovely to be on the show.
Well, let me start with you, DG. What exactly is this plan going to do, apart from such issues as raising awareness? When it delves deeper into the issues, what is it exactly that it will be doing, or it will seek to do?
Firstly, the plan is intended to raise awareness, first and foremost. It's to educate. But secondly, and I think most importantly, is to ensure that each sector of society has its responsibility clearly articulated in the plan, firstly, and secondly, makes every effort in ensuring that it carries out those responsibilities that it, as the sector, would have identified and have committed itself to, both in terms of actual actions that it will do, and secondly, in terms of the resources that each sector will put behind the plan. So those in the main are the key initiatives that are going to be driven under this National Action Plan.
Now, before coming up with a draft, did you take a step or two, maybe three back to say, how did we get to where we are before we even determine whether, for example, I know it's something that may be obvious, that education should be one of the key pillars of this. In other words, of the priorities, that the aim should be to educate people around these issues. But was there an exercise before you even started doing anything to say, let's take a step or two back and say, how did we get to where we are right now?
Indeed, Vuyo, there was an exercise, and that exercise was looking at, since 1994, what are the biggest issues that the country is still contending with. Whilst 1994 was a very big year for us, a very historic year for us as a country, there were issues that were lying, so to speak, undealt with, and racism was one of those issues, fundamentally. Perhaps even before we talk about xenophobia, racism was a big issue. Discrimination was a big issue. But obviously, soon after 1994, we were still loving each other. We were still respecting each other because we were still trying to build a country. But very soon after that, it became clear that the process of building a country is a very hard one, and these issues must be dealt with. And I think in 2001, when the Durban Declaration came out, it then became clear that we as a country must commit ourselves to developing this National Action Plan to root out racism, to root out discrimination, to root out inhumanity that is associated with these ills. And therefore, this is how we got here. And so that process of determining how we got here may not necessarily have been a formal process like a commission of inquiry, so to speak, but it was a process nonetheless that took into account everything that happened prior to the Durban Declaration being adopted by South Africa.
Let's bring in Stanley Hankerman. Stanley, I mean, your institution, the Institution of Justice and the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, had been dabbling with these issues, especially after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had done its work. Were you surprised by the turn of events, the stuff that we've seen, especially over the past few months? And were we really as loving of one another as the DG is suggesting?
Vuyo, let me say first and foremost that we weren't surprised. If we think of the history of this country, it's a history of exclusion, it's a history of domination, it's a history of humiliation, and I think that if we naively thought that everything will just fall into place, it wasn't going to happen. So we shouldn't really be surprised because we didn't really deal with the fundamental problems within our society. And that is the fact that over hundreds of years, black people were humiliated, black people were less than, and so it built into black consciousness very often, a sense of inferiority. And so we had our Steve Bikos who reminded us about who we were. But apartheid and colonialism was so successful that it ingrained this inferiority. On the other hand, it did exactly the opposite for white people. This ingrained sense of superiority. And they're not even aware of it. And so when things come to a head and we have to confront each other, guess what? We're going to fall back to those things that we are comfortable with. And so one shouldn't be surprised that we had these incidents of racism. And in fact, what the new South Africa has done is it has freed us politically, and it gave us this wonderful constitution where you have freedom of expression and all of that. And people have just used that in order to articulate what is deep down in their hearts. And so because we didn't work hard at addressing those fundamental things, you know, we assumed too much about each other. We really thought that we were going to be friends, and we're going to hug and love each other and live happily ever after. But human nature is not like that.
DG, looking at where you had to start with this process, and with the benefit of hindsight, was there a point at which someone like you sat and thought, maybe there's somewhere where we have to take responsibility for the somewhere where those of us who were in charge of the important levers of our democracy perhaps dropped the ball?
Vuyo, I would agree with you. I would agree with you on two reasons. Firstly, I think from 1994 up until 2001, hard work needed to have been put in place by all of us, by government primarily, but by civil society, by business, by the religious community. Everybody needed to have taken a responsibility to build this nation. And yes, we didn't address the most fundamental issues, such as race. We didn't address that. So yes, responsibility must be taken, and yes, responsibility must be taken by government first and foremost. So yes, I agree. Secondly, I think we needed to do much more after the Constitution was adopted, because the Constitution clearly sets out the values that South Africa needed to aspire to, but the values that South Africa needed to put in place. And I think we failed ourselves, but we also failed the country in not taking that opportunity as soon as the Constitution was adopted into law, to implement it in a manner that was going to be hard, but was going to be also consistent, and ensuring that we root out any form of discrimination, fundamentally racism.
Well, Stanley, I'm sure, those of us who had the privilege of being involved so intimately in processes like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, those of us who had access to some of the best brains in this country who were dabbling in these areas, before 1994, but also in post-apartheid of South Africa, who were in privileged enough positions to be able to grapple with these issues and perhaps to show some leadership and foresight. Shouldn't we too take responsibility for not having done what we ought to have done right from the beginning? Were we loud enough for those of us who were able to say some things? Were we active enough for those of us who had platforms like universities, like institutions like yourselves, with people like Charles Villavicencio, and with all the history that came with setting up even the very institution that on whose behalf you are now speaking?
We are absolutely. There are no innocents in this. And to now stand with the luxury of hindsight and say the government should have done this, yes, absolutely. But all of us, if you just think about it, what did we do after 1994? We had such a strong, vibrant civil society, and who contributed greatly to the fall of apartheid. We had a strong church that brought out the Kairos document that really stood up against injustice. And we all just relaxed after that, because we have a democratically elected government. And so we dropped the ball, and we are now playing catch up, but and so obviously there's a lot of damage that has been done. And in a way, I almost understand why the students are taking us to task. Why they're saying that we have sold out, we have not done enough. And in a way, we've lost a number of opportunities. I think if we had said in those first years after democracy to our white counterparts, what is it that you will do to take us forward? What is it that you are prepared to give up? What is it that you are prepared to share? I think the climate was right to say that, because we were all euphoric about this new start. We did that a number of years later when Archbishop Tutu called for a 1% wealth tax, and he was almost killed for that. And so it's about these missed opportunities. But again, as I said, we all have to take some blame for it. And certainly, as an institution, we also have to be careful that we don't defend that we cannot defend, and take responsibility for, all of us must take responsibility for the role that we have played in allowing all of this to slip.
Okay. Drop balls, allowing things to slip. The question is, what do we do next? Is the plan that has just been drafted now the solution to all the problems that we've identified? And is it what will take us forward? The question, though, being how and what becomes you and I's involvement in all of this. That's after this short break.
How great would it be to have Sia back for this reunion? He's been traveling Africa for years. He's impossible to get a hold of. We know what he drinks. Let's find him. Yeah!
You think it worked?
Hey, guys!
I'm coming home, tell the world that I'm coming home.
It all comes together with a castle.
Welcome back. You're watching On the Record, and tonight we're interrogating the new action plan against racism and discrimination. Well, in the last year alone, the Human Rights Commission says over 400 incidents have been reported to it. After the Penny Sparrow race row, the Commission said it expected the number to rise significantly. And while 2016 figures have not been released as yet, this is what we know so far. At the end of 2015, the South African Human Rights Commission received 470 equality-related complaints. 273 of these were race-related, making up over 50% of the total number of complaints. These figures exclude complaints lodged at the beginning of 2016 with recent events in the country. It's a logical assumption to expect these figures to be significantly higher in 2016. Or at least so thinks the Human Rights Commission. DG, if I may come back to you. Yes, we've got this draft plan that's going to raise awareness, that's going to ensure that concerns of individuals who are affected by racism are really more effectively addressed. It's going to engender commitment from the various sectors, as you mentioned earlier, with each sector knowing what its responsibilities should be, and so on. The question is, how do we mobilize, or how are you going to mobilize civil society to buy into these programs, to be aware, one, of what is going on, but also to take part in the programs, which I would assume is probably the most important thing that needs to be achieved?
Vuyo, I think we are lucky though, because a lot of work has been happening behind the scenes. Civil society organizations are mostly very motivated to be part of this process because we have been working with them. Remember, Vuyo, we didn't start working on this plan last year. We started working on this plan as soon as we came back from Durban after the conference. Obviously, we have been working on and off until now, but momentum picked up last year naturally. Civil society is with us. Civil society organizations are with us. We've done preliminary, so to speak, consultations before we went to cabinet. where we consulted within government, we consulted civil society organizations, we consulted some community members before we could go to cabinet, just to get a sense of where people were and how people wanted to move forward in developing this document. So civil society is already with us. Are we dealing with all organizations that are civil society, human rights-based organizations at this point? The answer is no. So we need to go out and get a lot more people to be involved and a lot more civil society organizations to be involved. But we are comfortable because we already have a good base to start from. And that is what I'd like to say in relation to that. So how do we then move forward in getting civil society to be engaged with this process? Yesterday was a big start. And now as we move forward, we are moving towards the whole of March. We are doing consultations until June. We will be consulting civil society, we will be consulting communities in various areas, we will at ward levels even. And we are hoping that once we have done that, we should be able to have a more solid document that we'll be taking back to cabinet and then after approval depositing it with the United Nations. I must indicate as well that we are not only looking at civil society as structures of civil society, we are looking at the academia, we are looking at all levels of education in South Africa. We are looking at religious communities and so on. And we believe that all of these people and all of these institutions and organizations are powerful enough in their own right to be able to mobilize in their own spaces and to come up with their views and bring them to the table, to the steering committee, so that we can finalize the document with the inputs of South Africa. Remember, Vuyo, this document is not a Department of Justice document. It's not a government document. It is the document of the people of South Africa, and the people in South Africa and the people of South Africa must ensure that they find a way of making inputs into this document.
Stanley Hankerman, what should the people who are steering this process be taking into account? Perhaps you could share with us some of the peculiarities of organizations like yours that are operating in this space. What would you give them? What would you equip them with? What would you advise them to take into account more specifically?
Well, the first thing that I think civil societies bring is that they have a presence in communities. They have a presence in different spaces. So civil society brings that. But I think, just looking at the conference that just concluded, my sense, and I have to agree with the DG, there's a strong buy-in from civil society, because this is not a political document. This is a document that affects every South African. And so as a civil society organization, we endorse this, but also as part of broader networks that we're involved in, we work together. And one of the networks we are involved in is the Anti-Racism Network of South Africa. And we have, as a network, committed to take this to our communities, to take this to the different areas where we operate, because I think it's a good start. It's not perfect, but as we allow members of civil society and members of communities at grassroots level to help shape this, we will strengthen the document. I think it's a very good start, and so as a civil society organization, I think we need to support this. We've seen it. I chaired a panel that consisted of sport, youth, there was business, and even the media, and all of them in principle endorse this, because it is about us as a country and how we relate to each other. And if we don't talk, we're never going to defeat this demon of racism. We're not going to defeat the demon of xenophobia and other intolerances. It's only together, and that is why, as an organization, we support this.
DG, just from a cursory reading of the of the document, there's going to be a special emphasis on priority groups. Among those groups, we're talking about the rural and urban poor, people who are in extreme poverty. We're talking about stateless persons. Incidentally, we have cases going on right now as we speak. We're talking about people living with AIDS. Take us through the importance of a special emphasis or of targeting these priority groups.
Vuyo, we start with an understanding that this document is fighting discrimination in whatever form. So we start there. We are saying that we are targeting each group because we believe that no group in South Africa should be prejudiced in any manner or form by virtue of being that group, whether it's women, whether it's LGBTI people, whether it's black people, whether it's white people even. We do not want anybody being discriminated against. So how are we going to move forward? We have Chapter 9 institutions in South Africa that are working very hard behind the scenes in support of this document, guiding us as to how to work on this document, but making themselves available to support each of those groups in preparing their inputs and putting those inputs in a document form, so that those documents then form part of the main document, which is the National Action Plan that will be tabled. Secondly, we have the Foundation for Human Rights, and I must commend the foundation. It has done a sterling job in mobilizing society. Remember, Vuyo, there are service centers throughout South Africa, whether they are our service centers as the Department of Justice, whether they are from the foundation, whether they are from arts and culture. We are using each other, we are piggybacking on each other's infrastructure to be able to reach society and therefore to reach these specialized groups that you have already identified. But we are working with international partners as well. We are working with the European Union. We are working with the United Nations, various bodies of the United Nations that are in South Africa that are supporting us. So we are not short of support right now. I think we've activated a lot of support. Our Department of International Relations and Cooperation is assisting us in mobilizing that. So we are comfortable that we are not short of stakeholders, but there are things that we are short of, Vuyo, which perhaps we could be assisted with. We appreciate the airtime we are getting today, but we are going to need a lot more airtime to tell South Africa about what we are doing and to encourage South Africa to come forward and to tell us what South Africa needs for us to fight racism, xenophobia, and all related intolerances, including their gender-based manifestations. We are going to need a lot of airtime. We are going to need a lot of financial resources, which we believe each stakeholder should be able to mobilize in their own right without having to rely on government. As you know, Vuyo, I do not have to say government is very thin on money right now. So we are looking for creativity. We are looking for how people can work together in terms of maximizing those resources that they have to be able, so that we as government can use the resources that we have to reach those hard to reach communities in rural areas, in townships, whilst other people are utilizing their resources, whether it's IT, whether it's financial resources, to reach the people that they can reach. I think if we work together, we can reach pretty much everybody in South Africa before we finalize the document. Time is very limited. Time is very thin on our side. We have been given up to June to finalize all of this work before we go back to cabinet. And we are hopeful that with the support that we are getting from civil society, we should be able to reach that deadline.
Very, very briefly, DJ, have you decided on what would be the optimal governance model for this? I know there have been conversations around whether the Human Rights Commission is the ideal vehicle, and whether it's got adequate resources, or whether its performance, in fact, has actually sort of lends itself to that role. Has that issue been resolved? Have you decided on how the implementation is going to happen?
We've started that conversation. We have not concluded, because in part we want our stakeholders to be comfortable with the body that is ultimately supported by all to lead this process. Yes, the Human Rights Commission has been, its name has been put on the table, but obviously we need to have that conversation and finalize it. But we probably are likely to lean towards that direction of the Human Rights Commission. Whether they will agree, it's a different matter altogether, but it's something that we feel it can be done by government. Incidentally, Vuyo, perhaps if I can steal a minute, we sit here today. Tomorrow we are opening a conference on the a regional conference on LGBTI, and this is one of the way that we are showing that we are fighting discrimination. We are not only fighting discrimination here in South Africa, but we are fighting discrimination throughout the continent and throughout our own region, and that is why we are having this regional conference. It's very much related to the work that we have been doing in the past 2 days, and it's a continuation of that work, and we are very excited about that.
Stanley Hankerman, your concluding remarks?
Well, I think this is for me a wonderful example of how government can work together with civil society and recognize the strengths that civil society brings. I think by and large civil society want to play a role. We are equipped in many ways. As I said, we have access to the people, to the audiences, and I think if we do this in a manner where we see each other's worth and the roles that we can play, we can take this forward. I have no doubt about it that this can become a model for how government and civil society can work together.
Stanley Hankerman, Nonkululeko Sindana, thanks to both of you for really getting this conversation going this evening. Let's hope that for the good of us all and for the good of our country, we will be able to deal with this one too. Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, news broke today concerning the resignation of ANC Chief Whip Stone Sizane. Sizane's tenure as Chief Whip began in 2013. In the last 22 years, the ANC has had 11 Chief Whips. They have come and gone for various reasons. Tenures ranging from 3 years to only just a couple of months. Well, a wise man once noted that one is as good as their last performance. In this case, with his sudden resignation, one would hope that that saying isn't true. That's all we have time for on tonight's episode of On The Record. From all of us here, it's a good night, and we're leaving you with what was Mr. Sizane's last public performance.
Asizoyivumela loo nto leyo. Nabanontorotyhi mabane bengxola apha engathi bazawubhatalwa. Ayisizoyivumela loo nto leyo. Xa niza nee-questionable characters singena phi thina kuloo nto?
Honorable member, please take your seat.
With respect, General.
Point of order, cordial respect.
Honorable Chief Whip, please address me. Address the chair.
Can you instruct the General to sit down?
Okay. Honorable member, please take your seat. Let's do that.
The Honorable Olomisa is insulting the members of parliament, is calling them Onontoruchi. And therefore, he has to withdraw.
Honorable Holomisa, did you say that? Honorable Holomis, if you are confirming that you said it, all right, thank you very much. Don't do it conditionally, honorable member, please.